If Harvey had not driven past my stop that February night, I would have stepped off that bus, walked 3 blocks through the cold, and opened my front door to someone who had already decided I was a problem he needed to disappear. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened to me. I am 63 years old, and I have lived in Hamilton, Ontario, for most of my adult life. My husband and I bought our house on Garfield Avenue North nearly 30 years ago, back when the neighborhood had that particular stillness that comes from people who have lived side by side long enough to stop noticing each other. It was a good kind of quiet, the kind that holds. He died 14 months before that February, colon cancer. We caught it late, and the 8 months between diagnosis and the end moved in a blur of appointments at the Juravinsky, of nights when I fell asleep in the chair beside his bed, of forms and phone calls, and a grief that arrived before I was ready for it, because I had spent all my energy fighting something that had already decided. We had been married for 31 years. He had worked as a machinist at a steel plant on the harbor until his back gave out, and then he'd spent a decade as the benefits coordinator for his union local. He knew every clause of the collective agreement the way some people know scripture. He believed in it. He believed that workers deserved someone who actually read the fine print on their behalf. When he died, the Canada Pension Plan survivors' benefit was not enough to cover property taxes and hydro and groceries together. I had worked on and off through our marriage, mostly administrative work, data entry, records management, office coordination. I had not built enough pensionable years to have much of my own CPP, and at 62, I was too young for old age security. The mathematics of widowhood in this country are not gentle. My son, who lived in Calgary, offered money. I refused. I am not built for being managed by my children, even kindly. So I found a night position through a temp agency. A company called Heritage Benefits Administration, a third-party firm that processed supplemental health and disability insurance claims on behalf of union groups and employer associations across Ontario. They needed someone for the overnight claims audit shift, reviewing documentation packages, verifying that submitted receipts matched filed claims, flagging inconsistencies for the morning team. The work was quiet and careful and suited me. It required the kind of attention that leaves no room for grief to fill the gaps. My shift ended at midnight. The last GO bus toward my part of the city had long since run. But the HSR night route still ran, and the number 51 stopped half a block from the Heritage Benefits building on Barton Street and dropped me 4 blocks from my front door. The first time I stood at that bus shelter in November, I was not sure what I had gotten myself into. The shelter light was broken. My breath made clouds. I was 62 years old, alone, and waiting for a bus at 10 past midnight in a city that had gone quiet in all the ways that do not feel peaceful. The bus arrived 8 minutes late. The driver was a large man with a neatly trimmed beard, going gray at the edges, and hands that looked like they had done different work before this. He glanced at me in the mirror when I tapped my Presto card. "Long night?" he asked. "Getting longer," I said. He smiled without showing his teeth. Fair enough. His name was Harvey. I learned that 3 weeks later, when he mentioned it in passing, he had driven the 51-night route for 11 years and knew every regular the way a shopkeeper knows which customers always ask for a bag. Over the following weeks, he accepted my presence with the same calm efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. By December, I had started bringing him coffee. A large Tim Hortons, double-double, which I had learned from a receipt he once left in the fare tray, poured into a travel mug I kept in my work bag. I got it from the Tim's on James North before my shift started and kept it in the office microwave until 5 minutes before midnight. It was still warm when I handed it up at the fare box. "You didn't have to do that," he said the first time. "I know," I said, "but midnight shifts are long." He accepted it with a nod that seemed to carry more weight than the gesture deserved. Those 11 minutes on the 51 became the steadiest part of my day. Harvey rarely initiated conversation, but when he did, it mattered. He had a way of asking one question and then leaving space for the full answer, which is rarer than people realize. I learned, across those weeks, that he had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years before a jackknifing incident on the 401 outside Woodstock put him in physio for 8 months. The city driving job paid less, but he was home every night. Home meant his mother in a seniors building on Cannon Street, whose dementia had progressed to the point where mornings required someone reliable. He had restructured his whole life around that reliability. He spoke of it without resentment, the way people speak of decisions they have stopped second-guessing. He also told me one night in late January, when the windshield was fogged despite the defroster working hard, that he had a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 4 years. A disagreement that became a silence that became something heavier. He said it plainly, without self-pity, but his hands shifted on the wheel in a way that told me he thought about it every day. What I did not know then was that Harvey thought about more than just his route. He had spent 11 years on the night 51, and he had developed the particular alertness of someone who understands that quiet streets carry their own kind of noise if you learn to listen for it. He had noticed the man 3 weeks before I had. At Heritage Benefits, my supervisor had flagged a cluster of claim files for secondary review. 11 physiotherapy claims from a single billing provider over the past 7 months, all maximizing the per-session reimbursement ceiling, all with identical supporting documentation, down to formatting choices that should have varied between visits. The receipts looked real. The clinician's registration number checked out. But the pattern was wrong. My supervisor, a careful woman who had been in the industry for 20 years, put it simply, "Something in here doesn't smell right." She asked me to pull the full provider history going back 3 years. It took me 2 late Tuesdays and a Thursday to map what she had suspected. The same provider code appeared in 13 different claim files across 4 separate employer groups. Each file was technically complete, but cross-referenced, the volume was impossible for a single registered physiotherapist working out of a clinic that, when I checked the address, turned out to be a residential property in Stony Creek. I told my supervisor on a Wednesday morning before my cab home. She thanked me and said she would contact the Insurance Bureau of Canada. She asked me not to discuss it with anyone else in the office. I did not bring files home. Everything stayed on the Heritage Benefits server, everything logged, everything behind a password I had not written down anywhere. I did not think I was in danger. I thought I had done a careful job and that other people would handle what came next. That was before I noticed the man at the bus stop. He appeared first in mid-January, middle-aged, maybe early 50s, in a dark parka with the hood up. He was always there when I arrived, always on his phone, always positioned slightly outside the shelter. Hamilton in January is not a city where people stand outside voluntarily. The shelter was empty most nights. He stood outside it anyway. I mentioned him to Harvey one evening, casually, the way you mention weather. Harvey's eyes met mine in the mirror. How many times? 4, I said, maybe 5. He nodded slowly. I've seen him, he said. He gets on at Barton and rides 2 stops, gets off on Sherman, walks back the way the bus came. Something uncomfortable settled in my chest. That seemed like a lot of attention to pay to a stranger on a bus. He pays attention to you before you board, Harvey said. He clocks when you arrive at the shelter. I pushed the feeling away. Hamilton has its characters. People do strange things at midnight. Then the small things began adding up. One morning in early February, I came home to find my wheelie bin moved from the right side of my driveway to the left. I always keep it on the right. I live alone. It had not moved itself. I told myself it was the wind, though the bin had a latching lid. The following week, I found a flyer wedged in my mailbox. Not unusual, but neath it a blank piece of paper folded once. Nothing written on it, just tucked there. I stood on my porch in the cold and turned it over 3 times, trying to understand what it was. And then, 10 days before February ended, my neighbor's dog, a beagle who is reliably unbothered by everything, barked at the side of my fence for 40 minutes starting at 2 in the morning. My neighbor knocked the next day to apologize. He said the dog wouldn't settle, kept going back to the property line. He asked if I had seen anything. I said I hadn't. That night on the bus, I mentioned the dog. Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Has anything else felt off?" I almost said no. Then I told him about the bin and the blank paper. He didn't respond right away. He just nodded, and I could see something shifting behind his expression. Not alarm, exactly, but decision. The night Harvey drove past my stop, February had settled into the kind of cold that makes Hamilton's East End feel like a different country from the rest of the city. The wind off the escarpment cuts straight through whatever you are wearing. I had my coat buttoned to the collar and my hands around the travel mug I had already emptied, just for the residual warmth. We came up on Barton and Wentworth. My stop was at Barton and Burge, 4 blocks ahead. I was watching the street out of habit, the way you do after weeks of looking for a man in a dark parka. Then Harvey didn't stop. He drove through the intersection at Burge without slowing down. "Harvey," I said carefully, "you missed my stop." He didn't answer immediately. His jaw was set in a way I hadn't seen before. He pulled over on a side street half a block later, under a streetlight that was actually working, and shut the engine off. He turned around to face me fully. "I need you to listen to something," he said, "and I need you to stay calm while I do." My mouth went dry. He picked up his phone from the console. He had started keeping it face up there in the last few weeks, which I had noticed but not questioned, and held it toward me so I could see the screen. Notes, dates, times, short descriptions. He had been keeping a log. Starting in January, he told me, the man at the shelter had begun riding the 51 more frequently. Harvey had started noting his appearance times, when he boarded, where he exited. Always 2 stops before my street. Always walking back. Last Thursday, Harvey said, I was pulling out of Barton Terminal around 11:40 and I saw a gray Civic. Same one. I had logged twice near the stop. Parked on your block. Engine warm. No lights. Driver inside. I stared at him. Tonight, he continued, I drove your block before the route started. The Civic was back. different spot, closer to your house." My hands felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "There's more," Harvey said. He swiped to another screen. He had noted passengers, not by recording them, he was clear about that, but by writing down things they said when he was close enough to hear. People forgot that bus drivers heard everything. He tapped one entry, 3 weeks earlier, a man who got on at the GO terminal and rode toward the East End. Not a regular. Made a phone call, talked loud enough that Harvey had caught pieces of it. Words like audit, and she's getting close, and if she pulls the right threads, it's finished. He had gotten off at the stop before mine and walked toward my street. "This might be nothing," Harvey said quietly. "But I've driven nights for 11 years, and I stopped believing in coincidences around year 3. The air inside the bus felt very still. "Do you know a man named Leonard Price?" he asked. The name landed like a stone, dropped into still water. I had seen it once, in the provider history I had pulled at the office, not as a registered clinician, but as a listed business contact for the Stony Creek address. I had said that name aloud exactly once to my supervisor in the office, while 2 other people were within earshot. I told Harvey this. He nodded once. "Do you know anything about him outside of work?" I shook my head. Harvey set the phone down. "I kept notes," he said slowly, "because I learned once what it costs not to." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask, but I understood the shape of what he meant. He had kept his log for the same reason a careful person keeps receipts, not because they expect to need them, but because needing them without having them is worse. "We should go to the police," I said. He was already starting the engine. The station on King William Street was lit the way all police stations are lit at midnight. Too bright, too flat, the kind of light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. An officer took my statement at a plastic table, his pen moving steadily. Harvey's log filled 2 pages of a legal pad. When the officer stepped out and came back with a detective, older, careful eyes, coffee in a styrofoam cup, I understood they had recognized something. The detective asked me to describe the Stony Creek address. He asked the name again. "Leonard Price." He looked at his partner, then back at me. "Leonard Price lost his physiotherapy registration in 2017, he said. Investigated for billing fraud against a union benefits fund. He operated under 3 different clinic names before the College of Physiotherapists revoked his license." I felt the blood leave my face. The detective set a photograph on the table between us. A union local meeting, a dozen men in folding chairs, dated 2016. I recognized my husband in the second row immediately. The particular way he held himself at meetings, slightly forward, always listening. 1 row behind him stood a younger Leonard Price. "Your husband was on the benefits committee that filed the original complaint," the detective said. I covered my mouth with my hand. "He never told me the name," I said. "He told me he had reported something. He said it was handled." "He probably thought it was," the detective replied. "Price lost his license and filed for personal bankruptcy within a year. But he didn't stop. He retrained in IT, picked up contract work, doing back-end support for insurance administrators across the province. He has had system access to heritage benefits for 18 months. The room tilted slightly. "He doesn't know what I found," I said. "He knows I was auditing. He doesn't know what I documented." "No," the detective said, "but he knows your name is attached to the file, and he found out your address." Harvey's hand moved to the edge of the table, not touching mine, just close enough that I could feel the warmth. They moved quickly after that. A warrant was executed on Price's rental unit in the East End before 3 in the morning. What they found was methodical and damning. 4 years of fabricated clinic billing, routed through rotating provider codes. Over $400,000 in fraudulent reimbursements drawn from 6 different employer benefit plans. Fake patient files. Forged physiotherapist signatures borrowed from registrants who had retired or left the province. And in a kitchen drawer, a printout of the audit schedule at Heritage Benefits with my name handwritten beside the Tuesday and Thursday overnight shifts. Beneath it, a printout from a property records search. My address, a hand-drawn map of the block, an arrow pointing to my house. He was arrested near my street at 4:15 that morning, driving the gray Civic. Harvey's log had included a partial plate number. It took the officers 11 minutes to locate him. The weeks that followed belonged to investigators. The Insurance Bureau of Canada joined the case. Heritage Benefits was audited from the ground up. The fraud network extended to a second administrator in Mississauga and involved 2 other individuals who had supplied Price with access credentials in exchange for a percentage of the reimbursements. I gave a statement to the Crown's office on a Thursday afternoon in March, sitting across from a prosecutor who used words carefully and wrote everything down twice. I returned to that office 3 more times before the matter went to trial. I testified in the fall. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. I told the jury what I had found in those files: the repeating patterns, the impossible billing volumes, the residential address in Stony Creek that housed no clinic anyone had ever visited. My voice was steadier than I thought it would be. Leonard Price did not look at me during my testimony. He stared at the table in front of him at the same middle distance where I imagine he had been looking since the night they picked him up on my street. Harvey testified the morning after me. He spoke about his log, when he started keeping it, what he had noticed, why he had kept going. The Crown asked him, "If you had not maintained those notes, what do you think would have happened?" Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would have driven past the signs, and she would have gone home alone." The defense argued his records were the overzealous habit of a paranoid driver. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty, fraud over $5,000. Criminal breach of trust. Criminal harassment, attempting to obstruct justice. The sentence was 7 years. When the verdict was read, I did not feel relief immediately. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves very carefully for a long time and has finally been allowed to set something down. Justice does not give back the nights you spent afraid. It only closes the door. Harvey drove me home that evening. Not on the 51, but in his own car, a practical thing with a cracked dashboard and a pine air freshener that smelled nothing like pine. We said almost nothing for 20 minutes. When he pulled up in front of my house on Garfield Avenue, he waited while I unlocked the door. Same as always, I called from the porch. He smiled without showing his teeth. Fair enough. He still drives the 51. I take it on Thursdays now, on a new shift that ends at 10 instead of midnight. I bring him coffee. We talk more, about his mother, whose good days have been getting shorter, and about his daughter, who called him in November after the trial made the local news. She had read the story. She wanted to know if he was all right. He said he was, and then they talked for 2 hours. I sat with him in the Tim Hortons on James North one Sunday afternoon, the two of us with large coffees and nothing we needed to accomplish. He told me more about his daughter than he had ever told me in 11 minutes on a night bus. I told him things about my husband I had not said aloud since the funeral. His mother smiled at me when he introduced us. She said I had kind eyes. She did not remember my name the following week, but she smiled the same way, and I thought that was enough. My son flew in from Calgary in December. He stayed a week. One evening he sat at the kitchen table while I made dinner and said quietly that he was sorry he hadn't come sooner, that he hadn't understood, from a distance, how alone things had gotten. I told him I hadn't entirely understood it myself until a bus driver decided to keep a log. There is a young woman in my office now, 27, new to overnight shifts, still learning how to keep her eyes open past 2 in the morning. She reads the claims database the way I did at the beginning, carefully, but without yet knowing what wrong looks like. On her second week, I brought her a coffee and a butter tart from the bakery 2 blocks over. She looked at me like I had handed her something rare. It wasn't rare, it was just one person paying attention to another. My husband spent a career reading fine print on behalf of people who didn't have time to read it themselves. He believed that somebody had to. He filed a complaint against a man who was stealing from workers because it was the right thing to do, and because he trusted that systems would handle the rest. He died not knowing the rest had been left unfinished. I did not set out to finish it. I set out to pay my hydro bill and keep my house, and find some reason to be useful in a year that had tried very hard to make me feel like nothing was left. What I understand now, on the other side of all of it, is that the small choices are where everything lives. The decision to hand a stranger a warm coffee on a cold night, the habit of paying attention, the moment when someone chooses not to look away, not because it is heroic, but because they have already lived through what happens when they do. I gave my bus driver coffee every night for 3 months. One night he drove past my stop, and because he did, I am still here to sit in a Tim Hortons on a Sunday afternoon and feel, for the first time in a long time, that the future is not finished with me yet. This is my true story from Hamilton, Ontario.